The snow had already buried half the lot by the time I got the call. Room 6 had a leak, or maybe it was the pipes again. The guy on the other end didn't say. He just whispered, "Something's wrong with the ceiling," and then hung up. When I knocked on the door a few minutes later, there was no answer, but I could hear the shower still running, and a soft, steady drip that wasn't coming from the faucet. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel right. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. I'm Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working the front desk at a small mountain lodge about 2 hours outside of Aspen. These days I manage a guest house in New Mexico, but back then I was still up in Colorado, mostly working solo night shifts during the winter season. The lodge wasn't fancy. Just 12 rooms, an office, and a big stone fireplace in the lobby that made the place look cozier than it really was. The kind of spot couples booked for weekend getaways or folks passed through if they got caught in a snowstorm heading toward the Rockies. We had a lot of those surprise bookings, people stuck overnight. This story happened the second week of February. Snow had been coming down hard for 2 days straight, piling against the windows and swallowing the highway by nightfall. That evening we were technically full, but most guests had canceled. We had maybe 4 cars in the lot, and one of them belonged to Len, our overnight maintenance guy. I remember clearly because I was doing inventory in the laundry closet when I heard the front bell ding. Not the front door, the little service bell on the desk. The sound carried weird in that building. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then it rang again. Sharp, deliberate. When I stepped out, there was a man standing at the counter, still brushing snow off his coat. No gloves, no hat, just a long black wool coat buttoned up to the neck. His cheeks were raw from the wind, and his eyes. I remember thinking they were too calm. Not blank, not tired, just still. He didn't give a name, just slid a driver's license across the counter and a credit card with a Colorado address. I asked if he had a reservation, and he said, "No," in a voice so soft I almost missed it. There wasn't anything wrong with his speech, but the way he said "just one night" made me hesitate. I checked him in. Room 6, it was one of the back units with a view of the ridge. The snow was already so thick out there, I doubted he'd even see the mountains by morning. Still, he nodded like he already knew. We didn't speak again that night. He didn't come down for coffee, didn't ask about Wi-Fi. The next time I saw any sign of him was around 10:30, when Len radioed from the back hallway. He said he thought he heard something in the vents above room 6. Like what I asked, Len just said, "Not the heater. Something else. Scratching, maybe. Or dripping." Now for context, the old HVAC system in that wing sometimes made strange noises when the snow melted too fast on the roof, so I told him to check the attic panel above that room. I wish I'd gone with him. An hour later, Len came back to the office looking pale. He said the hatch to the crawl space was shut tight and the panel above 6 had fresh screws, newer than the rest, but he didn't see anything else. Still, something about it stuck with him because the next morning he asked me if the guy had checked out. He hadn't. In fact, when I looked at the booking screen, I saw that the charge had gone through with no incident. Card verified, no flags. But room 6 was still showing occupied. That wasn't unusual. Guests sometimes overslept or skipped checkout if they were snowed in. I walked down around 11 hosieries with a tray of fresh towels, hoping to offer a soft reminder. The door was closed. No, do not disturb. Sign, no voices inside. I knocked once, no answer. I knocked again, and that's when I heard the shower, running. Not loudly, just the steady hiss of water echoing against tile. I waited, then knocked a third time, and when there was still no answer, I used the master key. The room was warm, steamy, actually. There was condensation on the mirror, but the light in the bathroom was off. I called out, "Hello, sir," and stepped inside. The bed was made. Perfectly made. The comforter looked like it hadn't been touched. The TV remote was still centered on the nightstand. And on the little round table near the window, there was a paper napkin perfectly flat. Nothing written on it, just placed. I turned toward the bathroom, and that's when I saw the water running. Not from the shower head, from the ceiling. A slow drip, maybe one every 5 seconds, pooling into the bathtub below. No one was inside, no sign of personal items, but the steam that wasn't coming from the drip. I checked the floor heater. It was on full blast. Now here's where things started to turn. I backed out and went straight to the front desk to call the number he'd given at check-in. It rang 4 times, then clicked over to voicemail. No name, just a generic message. I left a note under the door asking him to stop by the front desk when he returned, but he didn't. By that evening, room 6 was still quiet. No lights on, no movement. I used the key again just before my shift ended. Still empty. Only now the water had stopped dripping. The heater was off. And the napkin gone. That night, Len came by again, said he'd been looking at the screws on the attic vent and noticed something strange. They were now rusted, as if they'd been there for years. I didn't sleep well that night. The snowstorm passed by morning, and when we tried to contact the guest again, the phone number was disconnected. The credit card went through, but it had been linked to a gift account, prepaid and untraceable. We eventually opened the room for booking again. No complaints, no damage, nothing ever turned up. But even now, sometimes when I think about room 6, I remember the shape of the water stains on the ceiling. They weren't round, they were narrow, like fingers. And sometimes late at night, I still wonder what Len would have found if he'd unscrewed that vent. Or worse, who might have been watching from the other side. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those stories that sits too close to the chest and most people don't know what to say after they hear it. But it happened. And I think that's what unsettles me most. Back in March of 2022, I booked a beachfront cottage on the South Carolina coast. It was one of those last-minute escapes. Daniel and I had just split 3 years together, gone in under a week. I didn't want comfort or conversation. I just needed space, somewhere quiet, somewhere unfamiliar. The listing showed a small detached guest house nestled behind a larger main home. Rustic coastal decor, a porch swing, and a direct view of the water. I'd been scrolling Airbnb for hours when this one popped up. The host's name was Miss Ruth, and she messaged me almost immediately after I booked. Her tone was kind. Lots of smiley faces, an old-school southern warmth that felt gentle without being pushy. I arrived late afternoon. The gravel crackled under my tires as I pulled in, and Miss Ruth was already outside waiting at the top of the drive. She was in her 70s, maybe older, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, even though it wasn't cold. Her hair was silver and pinned back, and I remember the way she smelled lavender, and a trace of cigarette smoke, like someone who hadn't quite quit. The cottage was maybe 30 feet from the main house, connected by a little stone path. It looked exactly like the photo's whitewashed siding. Seashell wind chimes, faded blue curtains that shifted even when the windows were closed. She showed me around briefly, made a few polite comments about the weather, and then left me to settle in. That first night, I slept better than I had in weeks. No buzzing phone, no well-meaning texts from friends, just the sound of waves through the walls and the soft creak of old wood shifting in the wind. The second night was the same. I made tea, read a paperback I'd picked up from a thrift store, and dozed off with the porch light still on. It felt safe. Still. Almost too still. The first thing that threw me was small. On the morning of day 3, I noticed my shampoo bottle wasn't where I'd left it. I remembered putting it on the sink, but now it was sitting on the shelf above the toilet. I don't use that shelf. I almost dismissed it, figured maybe I had been distracted. That's what breakups do. They make you question your memory. But the next morning, it was my towel. The white one I'd brought from home, not the one provided, had been used. Damp, draped over the bathroom door like someone had just stepped out of the shower. I hadn't touched it in days. That's when the unease started to settle in. Not fear, not yet. Just something low in the gut tightening in a way that made me check the locks twice before bed. I texted Ruth, keeping it light. "Hey, just checking. No one else has access to the guest house, right?" She replied 5 minutes later. "Oh, honey, no. Just me here. I wouldn't dream of bothering you. You relax, okay?" But I didn't. That night I left a lamp on in the kitchen. Around 3:00 a.m., I woke to a soft sound. Not quite footsteps, more like a dragging shuffle across the porch boards. I held my breath. The wind had picked up a little, and I told myself it was just that. But the next morning there were muddy smudges on the welcome mat. Barefoot. The kind of print you'd get if someone walked through damp sand and then onto dry wood. I hadn't been to the beach the day before. From that point on, I started taking photos of everything. Before I left the cottage, the towel, my toothbrush. Even how I left the blanket on the couch. It felt ridiculous, like I was preparing for a ghost to borrow my moisturizer. But I needed to know I wasn't imagining it. Later that day, Ruth invited me to come by for tea. I went mostly because I didn't know how to say no. Her part of the house was a cluttered maze of old books, porcelain dolls, and yellowing family portraits. She poured me peppermint tea in a chipped cup and asked questions in a tone that didn't quite match her smile. Where I was from, if my parents were still alive, what the breakup was about. When I mentioned my dad had passed last year, she reached across and gently touched my hand. Her skin was papery cool. "You let yourself heal, sweetheart," she said, almost like she was reciting a line she'd used before. That night I reviewed the photos I'd taken. My toothbrush, which had been on the right side of the sink that morning, was now on the left. The mirror had a single faint smear on it. A dragged fingerprint curved downward. I hadn't used the mirror that day. I wedged a chair under the door handle before bed, left the kitchen light on, lay on the couch in my hoodie, fully dressed, phone clutched in my hand. I didn't sleep much. Sometime around 2:30, maybe 3:00, I opened my eyes without knowing why. No sound had woken me, just a pressure, that crawling awareness that something is wrong. and at the foot of the bed, half lit by the hallway light I'd left on, was a man. Tall, shaved head, gray shirt that clung damply to his chest. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, he crouched down, not toward me, but toward the floor. He looked under the bed, slow and deliberate, like he was checking for something. Then he stood and walked out, calm, like he knew the space. I stayed frozen until I heard the door creak shut. Then I ran. Didn't grab a bag, didn't put on shoes, just bolted barefoot into the gravel drive, keys in hand, shaking so badly I dropped them twice before I got the car started. As I pulled away, I looked up. Ruth was at her window, watching, not surprised, not afraid, just watching. I drove to a gas station 15 minutes up the highway and sat in the parking lot until sunrise. The clerk behind the counter took one look at me and asked if I was coming from that rental down by the dunes. When I nodded, he just said, "You're not the first." I filed a report with the local sheriff. They searched the property, but found no man, no sign of forced entry. Ruth claimed she hadn't heard a thing. The listing vanished from Airbnb a week later. I never got my stuff back, didn't try. I figured leaving it behind was worth the cost. But I've never stopped wondering if that man had been in the house before, if he'd been watching me every night I slept, or worse, if Ruth had known all along. Whatever the answer, I don't think I was the first. And I'm certain I wasn't meant to be the last. The last real summer I had as a kid was the one where I stopped sleeping through the night. I didn't know it at the time, but that August would be the last time I ever felt completely safe in our neighborhood. Back in 2004, I was 16, still living with my parents in a quiet suburb just outside Denver. The kind of place where the biggest excitement was the ice cream truck looping around on weekends, or the new neighbor planting flowers in the wrong month. We knew most of the families on our street. People waved from porches, kids left bikes on the sidewalk, and no one really locked their doors unless they were going out of town. I had a part-time job at the local grocery store that summer. 4 to 8 most evenings, sometimes. Later on weekends, if someone called out. My curfew was 10, but most nights I was home before dark. My bedroom faced the street, and I'd usually fall asleep with the window cracked just enough to hear the hum of sprinklers or the occasional dog barking down the block. It started with a van. I first noticed it one Thursday night when I was getting home from work a little after 9. It was parked 2 houses down from ours, old and boxy, the kind that looked like it used to belong to a contractor or a delivery company. The paint was a dull gray, no logo or license plate on the front, just sitting there, engine off, windows dark. I walked past it on my way to the driveway and gave it a glance. No movement inside. I didn't think much of it, but it was there the next night, too. Same spot, same silence. By the 3rd night, I mentioned it to my dad. He shrugged and said maybe someone's guest was visiting, or someone was between apartments. Still, he agreed it was weird, that no one had seen anyone actually get in or out. By Sunday, I was watching it from my window. Something about it started to bother me in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just that the van was always there. It was that nothing about it ever changed. The tires were always turned the exact same way. The side mirrors never shifted. not even a fresh streak of dust. That night I stayed up past midnight playing video games with my headphones on. Around 1, I took them off and heard something outside, not loud, just a soft, metallic sound, like a door latch shifting. I got up, pulled the curtain back, and looked out. The van was still parked there, but the driver's side door was open just a crack. I waited, staring into the dark space between that door and the street lamp. There was no movement, no sound, just that faint gap where the interior light should have flicked on but didn't. After a while, the door eased shut. I couldn't see who did it. The next morning, I checked the sidewalk for footprints or any kind of scuff marks, but the curb looked clean. My dad said I was probably just tired and seeing shadows, but I stopped sleeping with the window open after that. The following week, it got worse. Every night between 1 and 3 a.m., I started hearing a soft, clicking sound outside, like someone slowly tapping on glass. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It would start near my window, then fade, then come back near the front porch. One night I pressed my ear to the wall and stood completely still. The sound wasn't rhythmic. It was hesitant, like someone trying to draw attention, but not quite committed to making a noise. The van never moved. On the 9th night, I told my mom. She believed me more than my dad did, said she'd been getting a weird feeling too, like someone had been near the back of the house. She started leaving the kitchen light on. My dad set up a cheap motion sensor by the front steps, but the van stayed. I called the non-emergency police line the next evening, told them there was an unmarked vehicle parked for over a week without movement. They sent an officer out around dusk. By the time the cruiser arrived, the van was gone. Just gone. No tire marks, no sound of an engine starting, nothing. The officer, Sergeant Williams, took down my statement and said he'd drive the loop again overnight. He asked if we had any cameras. We didn't, not in 2004. That kind of thing wasn't common yet in neighborhoods like ours. The next night, the van was back. Same spot, same direction. Only this time, the rear doors were open just a little. I could see something inside, not clearly, but enough to make out shapes. Boxes, maybe, or bags. It was hard to tell. I thought about calling again, but I waited, just stood there at the window and watched. At 2:14 a.m., I saw a figure step out from behind the van. Not from inside, from the opposite side, the sidewalk. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, head down. He walked slowly down the street, not toward the house, just pacing. Once he reached our mailbox, he stopped and looked up, right at me. I stepped back before he could see my face clearly. Or maybe he already had. I never did figure out if he was alone. The next morning, my dad noticed the motion sensor light had been twisted sideways. Not broken, just turned inward like someone had reached up and adjusted it. The van didn't show up again after that, but for weeks I felt like someone was still watching. Sometimes I'd walk past the living room window and swear I saw something shift in the neighbor's hedges. Sometimes I'd wake up certain I'd heard footsteps in the garage. Nothing ever came of it. Sergeant Williams called to check in one last time, said there were no similar reports in the area. He asked if I wanted to file anything formal, but what could I even say? That someone parked a van too long and looked at me once. The whole thing faded like a bad dream you don't quite remember, but still avoid thinking about. I'm 36 now, live 2 states over. I've had plenty of strange neighbors and noisy nights, But I still think about that van sometimes. I think about how it showed up without warning, stayed just long enough to be noticed, then disappeared like it had never been there. And I think about the man who stopped at our mailbox and looked right up at my window, not scared, not angry, just patient, like he was waiting to see who'd look back. The first time I noticed anything strange was because of the floorboards. Not the sound, the way they felt. Just a faint tremble under my feet one night, like someone was dragging furniture in the unit below mine. But it was 3:17 in the morning, and as far as I knew, that apartment had been empty for weeks. I was 19 at the time, studying computer science at Western Michigan. This was spring semester 2016. I'd found a cheap one-bedroom about 2 miles from campus, old brick complex, 30 units total. Nothing fancy. My building had a mix of older tenants and students who'd missed out on dorm lotteries. It was quiet, and that's why I picked it. I had trouble sleeping, and I needed a place where the only noise came from my own keyboard. My apartment was on the second floor, Unit 2B. The one directly below mine 1A had been dark since I moved in. Shades always drawn, mailbox stuffed. The manager told me the last tenant had moved out suddenly after a job offer out of state. Seemed normal enough. But starting in mid-April, things began to shift. It began with faint noises, thumps, low hums, and the occasional scraping sound late at night. At first, I assumed someone new had moved in, maybe a night shift worker getting settled. But when I asked the building manager the next day, he looked surprised. He told me 1A was still listed as vacant, waiting on repainting and an appliance inspection. That night, I stayed up late, finishing a class project, and started hearing soft knocks not on my door, but through the floor. They weren't random. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more. Then silence. Around 2:40 a.m., I stepped out onto the hallway landing just to reassure myself. The corridor was dead quiet and 1A's door was closed. No lights under the frame, no signs of movement. I went back inside, sat down and tried to ignore the new sound coming through the vent, something that almost resembled whispering. Not loud, not clear, just the occasional murmur of voice tones. The way you might hear someone talking behind a closed bathroom door, except there were no other doors between us. Over the next week, I started recording the sounds on my phone, mostly out of curiosity, but also to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it. The recordings picked up the knocks, same pattern every night, usually between 2 and 3 a.m., and sometimes underneath that, a low electrical hum. Things escalated on a Wednesday. I came home from campus around 6 in the evening and noticed a faint chemical smell in the hallway. Not gas, not cleaner, something sharp, metallic, maybe burnt wiring. It was strongest near 1A's door. That night, the knocking changed. It started earlier just after midnight and lasted longer, still rhythmic, still deliberate, but with no pattern I could decode. Then, for the first time, it moved. I could hear the knocks start at one corner of the floor beneath me, then continue across to the other side, like someone was walking the perimeter of the unit and tapping the ceiling with a broom handle. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I stopped the building manager on his way out and asked if he was sure no one had access to 1A. He gave me this half-smile and said the only key was in the main office, which he locked every night. He even offered to walk me through the unit after the weekend, when maintenance was scheduled. But I didn't wait. That Friday night, just after 2 a.m., I heard a door open. Not mine, the one below. Not fast or loud, but with that unmistakable echo of an old apartment door with too much paint around the hinges. I stepped quietly into the hallway and leaned over the railing. The first floor was dark except for the faint orange glow of the exit sign. 1A's door was wide open. There was no one in the hall, no light inside the unit, no sound. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before backing into my place and locking the door. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I sent one of the audio clips to campus security. I didn't know who else to contact. A guy named Officer Lyman called me back, said he'd take a look. He stopped by that afternoon, asked a few questions, then checked the unit below mine. When he came back up, he looked confused, said it was completely empty, no furniture, no signs of use. But the back bedroom window, the one that faced the alley, was unlocked. 2 nights later, the noises started again. Only now I wasn't the only one who noticed. The woman across the hall. Miss Evelyn, retired, had lived there since the late 90s, knocked on my door. Around 9:00 p.m. She asked if I'd been hearing voices at night, not shouting, just voices. I told her yes, and her eyes sort of glazed over. She nodded and said she'd heard the same thing years ago, back when a different tenant had left suddenly. I didn't ask for details. I think she was hoping I wouldn't. The following week, I started leaving a glass of water on the floor next to my bed. I'd place a coin on top of it just to see if the vibration from the knocks ever moved it. Some mornings the water was still, others the coin had shifted. Once it was gone completely. I found it on the carpet by the closet, standing upright on its edge. The final night I spent in that apartment, I was awoken by the sound of someone walking in the hallway. I checked the time. 3:11 a.m. The steps were heavy, deliberate. They passed my door, then stopped. I held my breath. The doorknob turned not sharply, but slowly. Just enough to rattle. I hadn't locked the deadbolt. When I finally moved quietly, slowly, I twisted the bolt shut and stepped away. A minute passed, then I heard a second knock, not at the door, from the floor. I never saw anyone leave. The next morning I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend across town. I returned the keys early and left the lease unfinished. I never heard back from Officer Lyman. I never checked the unit below again. But sometimes when I wake up around 3 a.m., even now I find myself listening. Not for footsteps, just for the knock. And I still don't sleep on the first floor. I don't usually keep in touch with the guys I've hired over the years. Some of them stay a while, some disappear after one bad week, and some never really leave your head. Back in 2019, I was managing the overnight shift at a logistics warehouse just outside Allentown. Long hours, low light, 36 shipping bays, and a rotating cast of temp workers who came in through an agency we used when folks quit unexpectedly. It wasn't glamorous, but the quiet suited me. I liked the solitude of the graveyard shift. It kept me out of traffic, away from distractions, and mostly away from people. That spring, we had a gap in coverage. One of our forklift guys broke his ankle, and another quit without notice. The agency sent over a kid named Wesley, said he was local, mid-20s, had worked in a few storage facilities. I met him out by the security gate just before 11:00 p.m. He was polite, soft-spoken, dressed like someone going to a funeral. Buttoned shirt, dark jeans, no logos or reflective gear, which was already a mark against him. But I've learned not to judge new hires too fast. Some folks start quiet and warm up with time. Wesley didn't. He didn't ask many questions, didn't seem confused either. Just followed directions, nodded a lot, and kept his eyes low. Most new guys pepper you with, "Where's the doc report?" or "What's the locker code?" But he seemed like he already knew where everything was, or didn't care. That first shift was uneventful. He worked a full 8 hours, didn't take his break, and didn't touch the vending machines or the break room coffee. I walked him through our bay layout, showed him where we logged damage reports, and pointed out the emergency exits. He said, "Got it each time," and then stared at the doors a little longer than most people do. By the end of the week, I started feeling something I couldn't quite explain. Not fear, just a growing discomfort. I'd catch Wesley standing still at the far end of the corridor, not working, not walking. Just standing with his back to me, staring at the dock door like he was waiting for something to knock. Sometimes I'd find him in the restroom, just washing his hands over and over like he was trying to get something off. Other times he'd be sitting on the bench outside the locker room, with the lights off, watching the delivery trucks idle through the fence. He never brought a lunch, never answered when other workers asked where he was from. On a Wednesday night around 12 a.m., I saw him talking to someone out back. Through the window near Bay 12, I could make out two silhouettes in the yard, Wesley and another man taller standing just outside the sensor light. When I stepped outside, the taller man was gone. Wesley turned around, calm as ever, and said he thought he heard a fox. There were no foxes in that lot, just scrubgrass, asphalt, and a cinder block wall. By Friday, I'd had enough. I called the agency to ask about his paperwork, just a routine verification. That's when things got strange. The rep on the phone sounded puzzled, said they didn't have a Wesley listed for our site, checked twice, then checked again, asked if maybe he was hired direct outside their roster. I told her no, he had filled out the forms in the warehouse break room his first night. She said there was no file under his name, no address, no payroll entry. That night I waited for him. He clocked in like usual. Same blank expression, same quiet nod. I told him there was a problem with his timesheet and asked if he could stop by the office before heading to the floor. He nodded, followed me in, and sat in the chair across from my desk like he'd done it 100 times before. I asked him to confirm his last name, and he said, Norris. I wrote it down, asked for his birthday, and he gave me a date, October 12th, 1993. Then I asked for his address. He paused, not confused, not startled, just quiet. Then he said, I don't live around here anymore. I asked where he was staying. He looked at the wall behind me and said, just passing through, I won't lie. I felt a chill go down my spine. He stood up, said he needed to use the restroom, and walked out of the office. I followed a few minutes later, but he wasn't in the hallway. He wasn't on the floor. He wasn't anywhere. I checked the cameras, watched him leave the office, walk toward the east wing, and then nothing. He never appeared in the next camera. Didn't exit the building, didn't clock out, just vanished. I called the police around 3:30 a.m., explained the whole thing to a local patrol unit. Officer Brewster came by, asked the usual questions. I handed over the paperwork Wesley had filled out, the badge number, the emergency contact line he'd scribbled on the intake sheet. Turns out the contact number was disconnected, and the badge. It belonged to a guy who died in 2012 in another state. When I asked about the name Wesley Norris, Brewster didn't find anything. No record in the DMV, no employment history. The camera footage was forwarded to a detective. They said they'd follow up. I never heard anything more. We had the locks changed that weekend, installed new badge readers, cleaned out the locker he'd been using, which oddly was empty. Not even a name tag on the door. But here's the part that stuck with me. On the inside wall of the locker, someone had etched 3 numbers with what looked like a box cutter. 2:47. That was the time he'd gone into the East Wing on his last night. The time the camera blinked and lost him. The same time I'd woken up in a cold sweat every night for a week afterward, like something had paused outside my bedroom door and just waited listening. I've worked nights my whole life. I've dealt with vandals, intruders, and one guy who tried to break in through the roof. But Wesley wasn't like them. He didn't come for money. He didn't come for anything. He just showed up, moved through our space like he already belonged to it. And when it was time, he disappeared, not in a hurry, not in fear, just done. Like he'd finished what he came for. I don't usually talk about that last night at the fair, not because I'm scared someone won't believe me, but because I've never figured out what it actually meant. It was October 2007. I was 18 and about to graduate in the spring, but that fall still felt endless in the best way. The fair had been in town for a couple weeks already, camped out on the edge of a giant flat field just past the outer strip malls. You could see the Ferris wheel for miles in either direction, especially when the sun dipped behind it. That Friday night it was just me, Charlie, and Denny. Nothing fancy planned. Just kill time, grab some food, mess around in the midway. We'd been going to that same fair every year since 5th grade, but that night was the last time I ever set foot in a place like that. It was already past 9 when we pulled into the lot. The lights made everything look warmer than it was. That particular October had been unusually dry, but there was a strange coldness in the air that night. Not wind exactly, just an emptiness behind the warmth. The kind that makes you feel like you're being watched even in a crowd. We bought the usual tickets, got a funnel cake, and wandered past the rides toward the older booths. That side of the fair was always a little quieter. Half the games weren't manned, and some of the trailers looked like they hadn't moved in years. There was an old fortune teller sign propped against a truck that wasn't even plugged in. We joked about it, but I remember Denny pointing at a row of lights above one booth and saying they were blinking in some kind of pattern. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I remember the lights were all red except for one green one that flickered on and off like a heartbeat. Charlie wanted to find the beer tent, so we split up. I went with Denny to this photo booth near the edge of the midway, the kind that prints out one of those 4-picture strips. The booth had chipped blue paint and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a long time. But someone had stapled fresh cloth around the inside new black velvet, like it had just been redone. We stepped inside, paid the $3 and hit the button. Only 3 pictures printed out. The top image was the 2 of us smiling. The second one was blurry, like the camera had been bumped mid-flash. The third was pitch black. Denny thought the machine had malfunctioned, but I noticed something else in the second frame between us. There was something that looked like a third shoulder. just barely visible through the blur. I didn't say anything. We just shrugged it off and kept walking, but I kept that strip in my jacket pocket. Later, we ran into Charlie near the edge of the parking lot. He looked off. Not drunk, not high, just distracted. Kept saying he was cold, even though he was wearing his jacket and gloves. He wouldn't explain where he'd been. Just told us he wanted to go home. We started heading for the car when a girl stopped me. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with jet black hair tied in a loose braid, and this oversized hoodie that had the Fair logo stitched on in faded red. I figured she worked there. She asked if I had dropped something and held out a napkin, just a crumpled white one, like from a food truck. I took it without thinking. On it, in small all-caps writing, it said, "You're almost out west. Nothing else. No explanation. No phone number. No logo." When I looked back up to ask what it meant, she was already gone. I spun around, scanned the crowd, but she wasn't anywhere near the booth or the food stands. Charlie thought I was messing with him when I showed him the napkin. Denny didn't say anything, but I remember him just watching the lights on the Ferris wheel like he was hypnotized. We left after that. The parking lot felt different on the way out, quieter. The air had gone completely still. Not even the sound of distant laughter or the buzz of the fair's speakers. Just the dry crunch of gravel under our feet and the headlights of cars leaving one by one. Charlie never made it home that night. We thought he bailed, maybe met someone or hitched a ride back to town. But when we called his cell the next morning, it went straight to voicemail. His parents filed a report, but there were no sightings, no receipts, no security footage showing him leaving the fairgrounds. The last anyone saw of him was me and Denny near the edge of the lot. 2 days later, I went back with a county officer named Delgado to walk the grounds. It was bright daylight, and the fair was still going, but most of the workers kept their heads down. We asked around. No one remembered Charlie. No one remembered the photo booth, and no one matched the description of the girl with the black braid and the hoodie. I still had the napkin. Officer Delgado took it as evidence, though he admitted it was probably just a prank. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt like something had marked us, like we'd wandered too far into a place that wasn't just about rides and games anymore. That photo strip, I kept it hidden in an envelope inside a yearbook for years. I looked at it once in 2013, when Denny passed away in a single car accident just outside Topeka. I don't know why I brought it out that night. Maybe to prove it had all been real. All 3 frames had changed. The smiling picture was now blank. The blurry one was clearer, and it was just me. Denny was gone. The last frame, the one that had been pitch black, now showed a faint outline of 3 people. But none of them looked like us. I moved south after that. Haven't been back to Kansas in over a decade. But every once in a while, usually late at night, I'll smell popcorn and diesel and hear that slow, metallic groan of a Ferris wheel turning in the distance. I always turn the TV on when that happens. I never ever go to look, and I don't take pictures in booths anymore, not even at weddings. I'd gotten used to long stretches of highway, especially in the Central Valley. Nights when the horizon looked endless and flat, broken only by the red flash of brake lights ahead or the glow of gas station signs. In 2015, I was working as a logistics coordinator for a short-term shipping contract, which meant I drove a lot between warehouses that barely showed up on maps. One week in April, I had to overnight in a town called Sonora, near the edge of the foothills, not quite mountains, not quite desert. It wasn't my first time staying in a cheap roadside motel, and it wouldn't be the last, but something about that night has stayed with me quiet and heavy like a weight I can't name. The motel was called the Pioneer Motor Inn, a long faded L shape of doors and windows with sun-bleached blinds. There was a vending machine with the button labels worn off, and a payphone bolted to a concrete slab like some kind of memorial. The parking lot was mostly gravel with a few cracked patches of pavement here and there, and no more than 4 cars when I pulled in. It was around 9:30 when I checked in. The front office was behind a smeared glass window, and the man inside, Tony, wore a blue flannel shirt and spoke through one of those metal speaker grills that never quite lined up with your ear. He gave me room 211 upstairs near the end. I remember that detail because of what happened in 209. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and burnt coffee, and the light above my door flickered every few seconds in a way that didn't seem random. I took a shower, clicked on the wall AC unit, and started answering emails. I was going to head to bed around 11 when I heard something next door. At first, it just sounded like voices, a woman talking low, maybe on speakerphone. Then I heard a kind of scraping, like something being dragged slowly across the floor. Not loud, but deliberate. I figured it was furniture being moved or someone shifting a suitcase, but it didn't stop. It came in short intervals, then silence, then again soft scrape, like someone was rearranging the room an inch at a time. I pressed my ear to the wall for a second, curious more than anything, but it was quiet again. Then, right as I turned away, I heard a knock, one sharp knock on the other side, exactly where my ear had been. It startled me, but I convinced myself it was coincidence. Maybe she heard me moving. Maybe she thought it was someone else. I didn't knock back, and the scraping didn't return. The next morning, I went to check out, and Tony was back behind the glass, this time flipping through a printed newspaper. I asked if someone had checked into 209 last night, and he looked confused for a second. Then he glanced at a clipboard and said, "No, that one's been closed for repairs." I must have stared at him too long because he added water damage last month. Nobody in there. I told him I'd heard something, and his voice shifted, not alarmed, but almost tired, like he'd heard something like this before and didn't want to revisit it. I left it alone, got in my car, and figured I'd been wrong. Maybe the sounds came from downstairs, maybe through the vents, maybe even from outside. 2 days later, I was routed back through Sonora and decided to stay at the same place. I wasn't trying to be brave or prove anything, it was just convenient. This time, I got room 107 on the ground floor. The place was nearly empty again, and as I walked past the office, I noticed a sheriff's car parked at the edge of the lot. A deputy was talking to Tony near the vending machine, both of them speaking in hushed tones. That night, nothing strange happened. No noises, no knocks, nothing at all. But as I was checking out the next morning, I saw the sheriff's car back again this time, with the back door open, and a woman sitting inside. She looked disoriented, like she'd just woken up or walked a long way barefoot. Her hair was tangled and she was wearing a motel bathrobe. I asked Tony if everything was all right, and for a second I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "She turned up in one of the rooms this morning. 209. He said it like a test, like he wanted to see if I'd react. I didn't. I just nodded and walked out. As I was backing out of my parking spot, I noticed something that didn't quite register at first. On the second floor, room 209 had the curtain drawn, but someone had pulled one narrow strip of fabric aside just enough to peek through. I couldn't see anyone not clearly, but there was a shadow there, a shape that didn't move. I didn't report anything. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I just drove. And even now, all these years later, I still don't know what it was. I heard through that wall, or what she saw before they found her sitting in the dark. That was the last place I ever stayed on the road. I still travel now and then, but I stick to hotels with too many guests and too much light. Thinking back over these stories, the empty apartments, the gas stations, the diners and rest stops, what gets under my skin isn't the moments themselves. It's what came before. The feeling that something's just slightly off. The wrong name on a receipt. A sound you didn't quite hear. A shadow that doesn't explain itself. Each story in this collection came from a place where people don't usually linger the corners, the gaps between destinations, the places you pass through without learning their names. But those are the places that remember you. They notice when you pause, when you stray from your path, when you look too long at something that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, if you're not careful, they look back. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I hope these quiet stories kept you company tonight and maybe left a little space for wonder or worry as you drift off. If you'd like to hear more nights like this, please follow the channel. Share the story with someone who might enjoy it and subscribe for future evenings. And tell me, have you ever been somewhere that didn't feel quite real, but you couldn't explain why good night?